Has it ever happened to you that you start to doubt everything you thought was real in your life? Maybe someone you had complete trust in let you down in a brutal way. Well, that happened to me, but in my case it turned out that someone very close to me, someone I loved and admired, turned out to be a total monster. When I was a sophomore in high school, my dad started something he called Project Alpha in our garage, but he never went into detail about what it really was. He just said it was his business, and that everything that happened there had to remain a secret. He even insulated the walls of the garage, which made me think that his work must be pretty weird or something dangerous, but I didn't dig too deep. I figured it was all conspiracy stuff and such, since my dad used to be a big fan of that stuff, and I figured that's where it was going. I couldn't judge him for being half weird. I myself had a group of friends who were a mixture of crazies and certain perversions, and they often talked about gross stuff they found on the internet. I used to stay away whenever the topic came up because I'm not very active on the internet in the first place generally. I would just look up NFL or NBA recaps, aside from gossiping on social networks like Twitter or Facebook, but nothing more than that. One fine day, my friend Zach started talking about something I had never heard of before, and I hadn't been able to get the idea out of my head since: the dark web. What he was saying about it was terrifying. Ads for hired thugs, stores selling every kind of drug imaginable, organ sales, and other creepy craziness. I don't know why, but somehow what he was saying started to really intrigue me. Was there really such a place on the internet? So that weekend we agreed that he would show us what he meant and what the deep web was all about. When Saturday finally came, we all arrived at Zach's house on time, so without wasting any time we went into his room and he showed us how he managed to access that part of the internet. And it wasn't long before we all realized that he wasn't kidding. All those horrible things he had mentioned were right there, and we were all very shocked to see the amount of illegal stuff that was all over the place like it was nothing. There were ads offering drugs of all kinds, some I had never heard of before. We also visited a page where there was an extensive collection of grotesque pictures of people killed by the police in confrontations, chases, and the like. Zach told us that all of these photos were from police files, and it made me wonder, how does someone get access to FBI files and just post them like that? It was completely insane. After about 20 minutes of scrolling, Zach found a link to a live stream that had no name. This piqued everyone's curiosity, so we didn't hesitate to click on the link. Immediately, the screen went completely black, and suddenly we found ourselves looking at a digital clock that was counting down. There was a sort of tension in the air, and when it reached 0, the screen went completely dark. For the next 30 seconds, all we could hear was rough, heavy breathing, and we were all very intrigued. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared, probably from a flashlight, and revealed a very strange guy. He was wearing a clown mask, but a very ugly one, a top hat, a fancy suit, and a cape. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it was real. When this strange guy opened his mouth, his voice sounded weird and distorted, like he wanted to hide who he was. He said something like, "Good evening, thanks for joining us. We have a good show for you today." And he called himself Happy Harry. Hearing that name, we thought he was dealing with some kind of magic act, humor, or anything related, but instead, the guy was about to unleash a real horror show. Suddenly, the screen changed and we saw a small room with red walls. In the back were two women. One was quite obese and the other was, let's just say she was more attractive. Both were trapped against the wall, hanging by both arms with chains. At that moment, Happy Harry approached the obese woman. He said something like, "You're ugly, creatures like you don't deserve to be here, only the pretty ones." Then he looked at the other woman and asked her if she agreed, but she said nothing. They both looked terrified, and frankly, it didn't look like something faked, it didn't look like an act. "I have something special for you, honey," he said to the attractive girl. "But first, let's deal with the fat, ugly one," she continued. I started to get nervous, wishing this was all just some weird show, some setup to entertain. But with all the craziness we'd seen on the dark net up to that point, I doubted this was it. Happy Harry asked for applause, and a pair of hands appeared from outside the chamber, cheering him on. After that, he walked over to the overweight woman and wielded a pair of huge garden shears, saying, "Too bad you're not prettier, then I wouldn't have to do this." At that point, he started doing something unthinkable. He started cutting the woman on different parts of her body, and the screams that followed were deafening and absolutely chilling. My friends and I were paralyzed, and one of my friends started vomiting from disgust. Then I watched as this guy pulled out a chainsaw. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I swear I was serious. It was a real chainsaw. I felt lost and dizzy when I heard the sound of the chainsaw start up, and at that moment, the overweight woman passed out from shock, while the other one couldn't stop crying from panic. Then Happy Harry turned off the chainsaw and yelled for a whip to be passed to her. Out of nowhere, an invisible assistant threw him a whip, and he began to use it in the most brutal way imaginable against the crying girl. At that moment, I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my mouth. We were all completely terrified, disgusted, outraged, and in shock. Her attack was so horrible that from so much twitching and writhing in pain, the girl's chains gave out and she collapsed to the floor. Now it was my turn to vomit from the panic and horror I felt. What was worse, that broadcast had over 6,000 people logged on, and most of the comments were horrifying. People seemed completely fascinated with the atrocity that was happening on screen. It was sickening. At that point, Edgard, another of my friends who was there, wanted to write a comment to insult all those sick people and threatened to call the police. But Zach stopped him right away, warning him not to even think of doing such a thing, as they could trace where the message came from and retaliate. We were all more terrified now, and Edgar told Zach that he would call the police anyway, and we all agreed. Then Edgar pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, but to our horror, the call was forwarded to an unknown number, and suddenly a distorted voice, exactly like Happy Harry's, spoke to us. If I were you, I wouldn't do that. Edgard. In that instant, we all froze. How come this guy mentioned my friend? Then a chat box opened up on the computer, and his full name and address appeared on the screen, as well as Zach's. We all froze, completely paralyzed. Then Happy Harry, now in full transmission, walked up to the camera and said, "I have all the information I need from you, brave boy. So it looks like we'll be seeing each other soon." Then he turned to the woman again, picked up the chainsaw again, turned it back on, and I don't even want to describe what he did next to those poor women, because my stomach churns every time I remember it, but it's something that will haunt me forever. Meanwhile, Edgard was on the verge of collapse, because although Zach's name also came up, it was clear that he was the one to whom the threat was directed. Zach slammed the computer shut, and I huddled in a corner, trembling with fear. Immediately, our friends began to leave, but I decided to stay with Edgard and Zach even though I was terrified. Luckily, nothing happened that night, but none of us slept through the night, and we were a nervous wreck. The next few days, Edgar was completely disconnected. He was like a ghost, didn't pay attention in class, and was extremely quiet at the lunch table, when he was usually the most talkative. A few weeks passed, and things seemed to calm down. Edgard was back to his old self, and the dark web scare seemed to be behind him. But one Friday night, while I was watching a TV series, there was a news preview, and in it, there was a report of a homicide that had occurred just a couple of hours ago in a residential complex that was only a couple of miles from my house. I froze as I saw the reporter standing in front of Edgard's house. My heart sank to my stomach as I heard that his mother, father, and 2 brothers had been found dead, and that he was missing. At that moment, I began to shake uncontrollably. I couldn't even speak, cry, scream, nothing. My mind went blank and my body did nothing but shudder. At that very moment, I received a call from Zach, completely terrified, asking me if I had seen the news. I answered yes, my voice still shaking, and he told me that at that moment he and his family were getting their things ready to move to a relative's house in another city, and I wished him luck and told him it was definitely for the best. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. At one point, I felt the need to go to the bathroom because my stomach was a mess from so many horrible emotions: fear, sadness, and anguish. I was a nervous wreck. When I went out into the hallway, I saw my dad coming up the stairs. He was covered in mud, which I found very strange. I asked him what he had been doing, and he, with a regretful sigh, told me he was fixing a sprinkler. I told him he was doing what he had to do. Then he went to his room and I went to the bathroom. When I came out, instead of going back to my room, I was so stressed and nervous still that I started walking around the house, and suddenly I got the urge to check the basement. I don't even know why I chose that moment, but I was curious about what Dad was doing in that place and thought that going to take a look would be a good way to distract my mind and not think so much about what had happened. I went downstairs and started looking around. Everything looked the same as the last time I was there, except that some things were in different places. Then looking under the stairs, I saw something strange. A door that definitely wasn't there before, so I walked over and opened it. When I did, a light came on automatically, and what I saw left me paralyzed. It was a small room with red walls and some weird tools in the corner. There were blood-stained garden shears and a chainsaw on the wall. On a desk was a computer and a webcam. Then I saw the mask, the same scary clown mask worn by the guy we knew as Happy Harry, the monster who killed, tortured, and murdered those women, and most likely Edgard and his family as well. My heart stopped as I realized I was in the same room where I had had that horrible live broadcast weeks before. At that moment, I heard my dad yell from upstairs as he realized the basement door was open. He came down the stairs cursing, but was stunned when he saw me at the entrance to his secret room, holding the mask. I will never forget that moment. We looked at each other in an awkward silence that lasted an eternity. He didn't say anything, nor did I. I just threw the mask on the floor and walked past him, brushing his shoulder with mine. I couldn't describe what I felt at that moment. I think there were so many emotions that in the end they canceled each other out and I was basically left with nothing. It sounds strange, I know, but suddenly all the overwhelming emotions I felt that night just vanished in that instant, and I felt nothing, just emptiness, as if something in me had died. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the police number. I didn't even bother to lock the door to my room because I wasn't afraid either. On the contrary, I felt that if my father came in and killed me, he would be doing me a huge favor. But he didn't. That same night, he was arrested. There was no need to look for him. He was in the basement, in the same room with red walls. He hadn't left there since I left him. Dad had soundproofed the walls so no one could hear what was going on there, and my friend Edgard and the two women from the live broadcast were buried in our garden. Their bodies, or what was left of them, were piled on top of each other, as if they were just garbage to him. That explained why my dad often stayed working in the garden overnight. It turned out that he had taken on the character of Happy Harry the Clown on the dark web because he confessed to murdering a man in 1996. He was a children's party clown who called himself that. It has been 7 years since I found out the truth about him. I have not been to see him in prison once. That man is not my father. I don't know that disgusting guy. My father was a hard-working, decent man who loved and admired me, not that sadistic, repulsive monster who will soon be executed by lethal injection. I would like to say that I feel bad about this, but I do not. All I feel is concern that perhaps some diabolical gene has been passed on to me. I fear that someday I too will break and end up being the same kind of monster he is. At least I'm reassured to know that Happy Harry is no longer a threat to my friends or anyone else. But I always wonder who is the one holding the camera.